Hi, everyone. Welcome to Compliance Unplugged. I'm Joanne Klein. I'm an MVP and owner of my own consulting company, Next Novus.
And I'm David Drever, also an MVP, and I work with Protivity. What do you want to talk about today, Joanne?
I want to talk about something that I run into quite often with customers of mine, and that is most customers I work with, anyways, have implemented information protection first before implementing retention and data lifecycle management. And
Yep.
because of that, often there's maybe some assumptions or ideas about retention labels versus sensitivity labels, and kind of applying the same constructs to one from the other. And although there are some similarities, there are some key differences that I think are pretty important to understand.
I love this topic. I get it all the time too. Like people are like,
Okay.
aren't they the same thing? Yeah.
Yeah,
No, they're not.
they're not the same thing.
Yeah.
It's that word label, right? Like it's
Yes.
just kind of an overused term. So I have one slide with kind of some key points that we can walk through to demonstrate the differences.
Excellent.
Okay. So I'll start with going from left to right. So label purpose. This one's maybe stating the obvious, but these two labels are very different from each other and are serving a different purpose for a business.
Yeah.
On the retention label side, it's meeting whatever regulatory obligations you may have, or legal obligations or operational obligations for a specific file or email. And you can have all kinds of controls on that, on how long it's retained for and at what point it's deleted. So that's the business purpose, maintaining business records across your organization, that a retention label sets out to do. A sensitivity label has nothing to do with how long something is retained for, but it applies protection controls and access controls on a file based on the way perhaps that it's been classified. So it's serving a different purpose. Both are required. I would say they're complementary controls to each other, of course. But from the onset, they're really serving different needs that our organization has.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on, only one for each. So this is pretty straightforward. You can only have one retention label on a document. You can only have one sensitivity label on a document.
Yeah.
As much as you would like to be able to say multiple retentions on a document, it can't happen. There's no concept of tiered retention within Microsoft Purview, unfortunately. I think the closest you can get to that, Joanne, my argument would be daisy chaining. Is if you want to go from one label to another, but you can't have two labels at the same time. Again, you're still going from one to the other. Same thing with sensitivity. You can only have one label on a document at a single time being applied by a person.
So do you think this is where the concept of, on the sensitivity label side, a sub-label? I mean, it is a way of having the group label and then the sub-label, both are there. So it's still only one sensitivity label, but it does
maybe, but see, Microsoft's moving away from that sub-label connotation now. They call them child labels, and so
okay,
it's
group
still,
and child as opposed to parent
sub-label,
and sub. Okay.
right? So whereas the parent label is more of a category. So I have this category of confidential, but underneath of it is where the child labels is where the actual label resides. So I'll have a confidential finance or confidential HR or something along that line. So for myself, I don't really see that as being two labels. I still see that being as one.
Okay. I just thought it could be deemed as an extra descriptor, I suppose.
It could, but it would be nothing, because when you actually look at it, you're really only looking at like what is the actual type of label.
Yeah, there is one and only one. Yeah. Okay, moving on. Make it required. This is certainly possible on a sensitivity label. It's actually a setting when you're creating, I think, the policy.
Yep.
But as much as records managers would love a retention label to be required, that setting does not exist anywhere. You can You can set it as a default on a library but that's not really making it required. With the right permission, someone can come in and remove that retention label. So there's no setting to make it required.
Correct.
Yeah.
Defaulting the label. So they both have the capabilities of defaulting labels. They just do it differently. So for a sensitivity label, your default actually comes from the policy. When you deploy your labels to the users that are receiving them, you can actually set a default label. And that default label can be for emails. You can have a different one for documents. You can have a different one for meetings. And you can have different ones for Fabric-related information as well. Retention's different, though. When you push out retention labels, there's no option for a default label on a retention. What you do have, however, is you can set defaults at the container level. So if I have a folder or I have a library, you can set a default retention. Sorry, I had a brain fart there, and I can say it's our show. You can have defaults at that level with document sets, things like that. But again, that is not being set by an admin. That is a more controlled at the owner level. So you would have to have some certain level of policing around that, I think, if you were a record manager. So you don't have a level of control you do at sensitivity levels.
Yeah. So you can't, as well, just to cover or to add to that, you can't set a default retention label at a site level so that everything you put in that site. I mean, you have to go down at least to the library level or lower to set
for which one, sorry?
For a retention label.
Correct.
Yeah. Publish the label. So on the retention label side, you publish labels to locations, basically, to Exchange mailboxes, users' OneDrives, SharePoint sites, Microsoft 365 groups, not to users specifically or users or groups. Whereas on the sensitivity label side, that's a very different construct. You publish a set of sensitivity labels to users or groups, and then they see those labels when they're working with content. So two very different models for publishing labels and making them available for end users. So on the retention label side, it needs to be published to a site first before you can even pick that label to set it as a default, let's say on a library that may be in that site.
Recommending the label. So with sensitivity labels, you can scan for what was classified within the document. So if it happened to find a credit card number or some other information within the document that your organization feels needs to have a certain certain label attached to it, you can actually recommend that from a sensitivity label perspective. Mm-hmm. As much as record managers would love it, we do not have that opportunity or that option with retention labels. Retention labels has no capability of a recommended label. Right. Some may see that if you set a default label on the library or something like that, you could be recommending a label at that point. I don't like that because as a concept for recommending a label, because you're basically doing it for the users already. They're not going to change it. They're just going to leave it the way it is because it's easier to do it that way. The difference between that and a sensitivity label is the sensitivity label is actually looking at the content itself to determine if it should be recommending a label or not. Yeah. So that's a big difference between the two.
Yeah. All right. Auto applying the label. So there's both retention label and sensitivity labels can be automatically applied to content through client side on the sensitivity label side, you can do it on the client. On both, you can do it on the service side. So it's done through auto labeling policies. So on the retention label side, you can do it based on a bunch of conditions. Many of them are the same between a retention label and a sensitivity label. All of the classifiers that you have inside Purview, SITs, exact data match, trainable classifiers, they all can automatically apply a retention label or a sensitivity label. There are a few differences. So on the, and correct me if I'm wrong here, on the retention label side, so you can of course use KQL, keyword query language based on a keyword. Can't do that on the sensitivity label side. So there's some nuanced differences between them, but you can certainly at scale automatically apply both types of labels to content.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Justifying a label change. So if you want to go from one retention label to another, or one sensitivity label to another,
Yeah.
you can do it, require a justification. Now, here's one thing to think about. If you're increasing the sensitivity of a document, there's no justification, because you are just making it more sensitive, making it more secure.
Yeah.
If you're lowering the sensitivity of a label, though, you have the option, and this is not required automatically. You have to, when you deploy the label, you have to put this option, turn this option on, that users have to justify. And so what they have some now, they have some default ones, like the wrong label is there, manager approval, but there's also you have to provide a reason, and all of this is audited. So if you lower the sensitivity of a document and you have to put in that justification, it is audited, so it can be tracked. Retention doesn't have that functionality built into it. However, one thing you could think about, though, is that if you're using record retention labels, in order to change a record retention label, you have to be a site collection admin on that site collection that document is residing in. So if you are not a site collection admin, you have to go to that site collection admin and just say, hey, can you change this retention label for me? They're probably going to ask why, and it's more of an informal justification, but it's still a form of a justification if you kind of stretch your thinking a little bit.
And I mean, that kind of dovetails into my thinking that you can't automate everything. I mean, there's a bunch of controls. Some are automated technical controls, some are manual controls or process controls. That's a great example of that. Is sometimes humans need to talk, and sometimes that's the control that you have in place, and I see that all the time.
I always say that the technology gets us 80% of the way there. There's still 20% there for process.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, multilingual label. This came up the other day. These two labels are very different in this regard. So on the sensitivity label side, you can have multiple languages for a label, and it will detect the preferred language on a Windows machine, and it's not set up through the UI. Maybe one day it will be, but it is something you have to do through PowerShell. So you do the label name and the description, but behind the scenes, it is the same sensitivity label. So all the downstream other purview controls will still work against the one label. On the retention label side, no such functionality exists. So if you have to do multiple languages, you're in a bit of a bind there. If you can, what I have seen is, if you're lucky enough to only have two languages, I mean, you can do language 1/language 2 if you want, but there's not a lot of options there on the retention labels side. So sometimes you have to just pick the main language and go with that.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, one thing I think a caveat to that is that you could have, and I don't like this solution, I'm just putting it out there, you could have multiple versions of the same label with different languages, but because they get pushed out to different locations, if you have a site that's mainly French, you could push the French version of the label out, that sort of thing. But I don't like that idea, because the problem with that is you're now doubling it could be doubling or tripling the number of labels you have. Right. What if you have mixed languages in your tenant, like in all locations? And that's really not an option. So you're going to have to decide what's going to work best for your business as a whole. And there's no one thing to think about too with the sensitivity labels is that you're telling it which languages to choose from. So if you do English and French, and then somebody from Germany connects and their preference is German, there won't be a German one automatically in there. I believe it defaults to the first one, so it default to English. Okay. But just something to be aware of. So if you're going to be doing multiple languages, make sure that you are considering all the languages that your organization covers. Yeah,
that's right. Okay, the last one.
Changing the label name. So this is something that, all right, I'm going to get on my soapbox, because I hate the fact that a retention label, you cannot change the display name. things change over time, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes you want to change those names. Your structure changes. So what Microsoft is bringing out now is not the ability to change the retention label name. They're bringing out a way to go and change all of the labels that have the old name over to the new label you're going to have to create with the new name.
Mm.
And I think it's still in preview. I don't think it's been released yet. It's been
Okay,
pushed
I don't
back
think
a couple
so.
of times.
Yeah.
But the concept behind it is if you want to change the name of a label, you can't do a retention label. You can't do that. It's actually very, very controlled what you are able to change when it comes to retention.
Mm-hmm.
Most of it happens to do with how many days your retention period is and who your disposition approvers are. And other than that, and your identifiers, like your
The
label
file
code.
plan descriptors.
Thank you. There's what I'm
Yeah.
looking for. Yeah.
I think you can also, maybe you said this, the retention period, like you can extend, you can change that as well. Yeah. Okay.
So you can change that, but that's about it. So what Microsoft has done, instead of giving you the ability to change that, and I'm sure there's probably some back-end reason for it, but the reason you can't change that, I don't know. But what they have done is they brought in a process where you can create a new label with all the same settings but different name, and then they're going to be giving you a process so you can go through your entire environment and change all those labels without changing any of the the other properties of the file, like the modified date and things like that.
Right.
On sensitivity label side, you can change the display name. You can't change the internal, what they call the name, which is actually translates into the internal name, but you can change the display name. Now, one sort of caveat to that is that even though you can change the display name, you still can't have two labels in the system that have the same display name. They have to be different.
Which kind of makes sense.
It does, but it does also become a bit, if you want to have site sensitivity labels and you want to have they're both like a confidential site. You have to, some organizations, they don't want to say confidential site or confidential location. They want to call it confidential, but you can't do that because if you have a confidential label for content, the only way you can probably do that is if you create a label that is both content and container based. And I don't like doing that. You and I have had conversations about that. I don't like doing that. I like separation of scope.
I'm not, too embarrassed to admit I've changed my stance on that over the years a few times. I don't know. So maybe that would be another topic
for another
day. Yeah. But you're right. If you wanted to, if that's the only option you have, if you want to use the exact same label name, is combine them. Yeah, for sure. So I think knowing these differences really ahead of time is very helpful for the team that's working on creating these labels, figuring out the settings. How is this going to work in our environment? You're kind of forearmed with this knowledge is I think probably helpful because they're two very different beasts at the end of the day, and it's good to just kind of realize that, oh my goodness, what we thought we could do on the retention label side, simply because we did it on the sensitivity label side, we're not going to be able to do it. So it's a pretty important thing to know.
It is.
Yeah.
Good conversation, Joanne.
All right. Fun as always. Okay, we'll talk to you later, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Bye.
Bye.